Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening in the series of conversations we're having with our beloved Sheikh, Wahid Azal of the Fatimiyya Sufi order. This evening, we're on part 7. And with this specific talk, we're going to focus on the relationships between men and women in the modern era. A lot of people have been reaching out to Sheikh regarding the aspects of what is the aspect of the divine feminine, masculine, and how the relationships between men and women, which have totally changed in the modern era. So he will educate us on this topic tonight. And I'm also honored that Sheikh Wahid Azal is not only my brother, but he's also my murshid now, since I took an initiation into the Fatimiyya Sufi Tariqa. And I'm truly grateful Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given this opportunity to me to have our beloved elder and Sheikh, not only in my life, but in the life of all of those in a world that's full of darkness right now, and people need light, they need hope, they need somewhere where they can get inspiration from. And we begin this talk with blessings from God, with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Most Merciful. And without further ado, I give salam alaikum to all of our viewers and nur alaikum to our dear Sheikh Wahid Azal.
Wa alaikum nur and Bismillah. It is my honor to be with you again, and it's even more of an honor that you have come into the Fatimiyya itself. Inshallah, with the guidance of the Holy Mother, the Supreme Mother, Fatima Zahra alayha salam, all will be well. Yes, a lot of people have been reaching out to me over the last year or so. A lot of Muslim men, males. Roughly between the ages of about, I would say about 20 to about in their mid 40s. And what I am gleaning is an incredible amount of confusion about a lot of issues. And I don't know where one should start, but I will start from this point here, is that I believe that over the last couple of decades, especially with the internet and the access to the internet, that a lot of perceptions about male-female relationships that were already, I would say, because of the postmodern world, fractured, have become even more fractured as a result, on one level, I would say, because of the expansion, for lack of a better way of putting it, of the so-called seduction industry.
Yes.
I looked into this. I looked at some of their literature. There was one particular book that I read very early on, not completely, just basically skimmed through the book, a book by this guy called Robert Greene called The Art of Seduction. And what this has done to the culture, especially to what certain social scientists and feminists call male toxicity, cannot be underestimated. It has done a real work on the heads of a lot of men out there. A lot of men out there are confused. Now the times are confusing. The issue of gender has become extremely confused in our times. But what I'm seeing is that, this is not just about the West, this is globally, because I talk to people in Iran, I talk to people in Pakistan, I've talked to people in Turkey, is that things that were taken for granted and were easy in terms of men and women coming together into relationship are no longer things that we can count on anymore. Both sides, both the man and the woman, you can't blame one or the other. It is a cultural problem. Are going into different directions. Things that were very axiomatic, for example, love between a man and a woman, are no longer looked upon as even possible. Even though, in the modern world, we see that at least the idea of romance was one that, even until maybe about 20, 30 years ago, was a very prominent topic with everybody. Everybody pined for the romantic lifestyle, the romantic partner, the fairy tale, etc. This, at this particular time, no longer seems to be an ideal that vast majority of people cling to. And there's a lot of damage being done both to men and women. I had one particular gentleman who came to me about a month and a half, almost 2 months ago, who was nearly suicidal after breaking up with a woman he had been dating for about 2 years. He proposed to her. She not only turned him down, but also revealed that she had been seeing, other people on the side without letting him know. And this has become, and this gentleman just had a complete meltdown. I counseled him, but then subsequent to my counseling to him, I see that this gentleman is slipping into extremely toxic, misogynist worldviews. Without really sitting back and reflecting about his role in all this, his responsibility, the causality of things, the greater picture, the sociology of the times, all of these things. And my view is that the forces of capitalism are not just material forces, but they're also occult forces. So this is probably the place where I diverge with a lot of Marxists and dialectical materialists, because they look at the forces of capitalism as merely material forces. I look beyond that and I see them as occult forces. And what is happening on the ground that one is witnessing is a real, there's a real problem we have out there, and how to rectify this for the future, because I have a child, others have children, and we want them to live in a better world. But at the ground floor, in what I am seeing in both the male and female, and especially with the males that I'm dealing with, does not give much hope about where things are headed. People's values are completely inverted. They are confused. And then on top of that, you have an industry that is very, very present, especially online, the so-called seduction industry.
Yes.
That is incubating ideas into the minds of the male, particularly, that are not only false, but dangerous and for a long-term basis, because the kind of objectification of the female that it is presenting is completely false. And what it ends up doing, the Muslim world and Islam is usually accused of being patriarchal and misogynist and that sort of thing. But here you have in the West an industry that is secular, that is only catered towards teaching the manipulation of women, gaining ground and becoming literally what the word, the German word Weltanschauung, worldview, of a lot of males out there who then go out there into the big bad world and then damage other women, and then in turn get damaged themselves. There's this constant inflicting of damage, of psychological damage on both as a chain, right? Rather than this problem being rectified. I hesitate to use the word healing because it's become kind of a really fluffy word amongst the New Age crowd, particularly. But to rectify the situation, to come to some kind of a resolution in the minds of both the male and the female of the species about how to conduct themselves, how to look upon the other gender. I spent a lot of time with this gentleman, counseling him, trying to, pick out these poisoned seeds that he has been getting recently. A lot of it has to do with himself. A lot of it has to do with his, raging emotions. He was really in love with this woman, and she let him down. But, his part in that whole situation was also pivotal. And it's taking me a lot of work, to get him to realize that rather than to internalize the problem, and then to, after the internalization of the problem, to then project angst and anger at the opposite gender, is to look at the bigger picture, the forces at work that have put him in the situation that he is in, and also placed that woman that he was with for 2 years in the position that she's in. The culture and what it has been doing, in my opinion, is deliberately trying to break up human relationships. It's deliberately incubating confusion. It's deliberately attempting to nullify the reality of love between a man and a woman. And so what we see instead, a lot of people have talked about it, and there's a whole genre of literature now in sociology and the social sciences discussing this, is what, for example, porn culture has been doing to the male mind and also the female mind simultaneously.
Yes.
Now, in Islam, there is a very set template of conduct that traditionally is expected. Unfortunately, even that is no longer prevalent in the Islamic world. I'll give you one example of this. In Iran, particularly as a result of the Islamic Revolution of Iran, one of the things that the regime in Iran did is that they legalized muta, temporary marriage. And what this has caused to a situation far worse than what we even have in the West. In the West, one of the normal complaints that a lot of people from the Muslim world make against in the society of the West is these many patchwork relationships where a man or a woman have multiple children from multiple partners, and there's never a constant flow from between a couple from point A to that people don't really grow old with each other anymore and have the same set of children, etc. But in Iran, that is supposedly an Islamic society, the same thing has happened. You have a whole army of children and a whole army of women who have gone through multiple relationships, multiple muta'a, temporary or siqe relationships. And this has caused such an amount of dislocation of the traditional culture, even though purportedly the Islamic Republic of Iran claims to be a traditional Islamic society, that it's unaccountable. It has damaged the psyche of that society beyond repair, in my opinion, at this point. And you see this in many other contexts beyond just muta'a. You see this in the context of the way that especially the expatriate Iranian community behaves, whether it's men or women, things that even the generation of my parents are just completely shocked by. Living in different times and that there's a different perspective, but this perspective does not necessarily mean that it is a good one, that it is helping the species, that it is creating balance, that it is creating equilibrium. I am not an advocate of any return to patriarchy. We are in a point in history that we cannot move backwards, and moreover, history does not move backwards. We don't move back in time, we move forward in time. Yes. Something that certain religious reactionaries don't understand is that, from the greater perspective, one of the names, God is both the pre-eternal and also the post-eternal, al-azaliyah wal-abadiyah. So we don't move back. So we cannot, cling on to ways of doing things that were done even, say, about 20, 30 years ago. Those structures have completely crumbled. To try to reestablish those structures that certain so-called neo-traditionalists are advocating isn't going to happen, and it's going to cause a lot more problems than it will solve. So the question is, what do we do? Now, although I am not a fan of, a person such as Julius Evola, because he was politically he was a fascist, but he wrote a lot of good books. Some of his perspectives I don't agree with, but one particular book that he wrote that I have been recommending to a lot of these fellas is his Eros and the Mysteries of Love, the Metaphysics of Sex. This is a very, very good book. Not all of its perspectives are ones that I subscribe to, but where he talks about the question of gender from the metaphysical perspective is one that I think a lot of people should, at least who are confused about these things, should at least consider. They don't have to buy into everything he says lockstep, but they should at least consider what he has to say, and especially the beginning of the first part of the book, where he breaks down the problem in basically the same terms that I've just laid out here. But what he says it should also be taken aboard, because he recognizes that we can't go back, that we are living in a poisoned society, as it were. But so what do we have to do? We have to take the alchemical perspective about all of this, since in alchemy, the poison is the gift. So we have to transmute the poison that has infected it. That has the venomous snake that has bitten us, the great cycle of time, because this era, according
Sheikh,
to them,
please,
is the Kali Yuga.
Please continue from the last 30 seconds. There was something going on with Zoom. It cut you where you talked about the aspect of the poisonous daggers that are entering into the male mind.
Yeah.
Please continue last 30 seconds.
what I was saying is that according to Julius Evola, in the introduction of his book, Eros and the Mysteries of Love, he puts his finger very poignantly on the problem that we're facing in this particular area. And then he uses an alchemical trope to explain how this problem should at least be approached to solve. There's an aphorism in alchemy that the poison is the gift, right? So we are living in a culture that is poisoned, essentially.
Yes.
But, as long as we live in the stage of being poisoned, we are trapped. So what we have to do is we have to transmute this poison into the medicine, as it were, right? And the rest of the books, he kind of explains and suggests how this can be done. Like I said, not a lot of his perspectives are one I agree with. I think that book and some of its very valuable perspectives needs to be updated to some point. He also wrote this book in the 40s and the 50s, where even then, compared to today, it was a very different world. But this is where we're at. And so what I'm seeing is that there's a lot of men out there, and especially amongst the Muslim communities of all different persuasions, whether we're talking about Sunni, Shia, Sufi, otherwise, where you have a lot of men who are not entering into relationships because relationships, even amongst this community, have become extremely transactional, whether it's between the families or otherwise.
Definitely.
And then if they venture into outside of the Muslim community, these men are becoming damaged by, whether it's by culture shock or whether it's by their own lack of understanding of the greater dynamics of work. They're not prepared, or what have you, a whole range of issues. And they're coming back even worse than when they went out in many ways. I have suggested this to several people, and I base this on some of the things that Wilhelm Reich talks about in his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, that one of the reasons, unnoted reasons, that we witnessed over the last 23 years for the radicalization of a certain subset of males, men who were just being radicalized into groups like ISIS and whatnot, is precisely because the problem is far more fundamental than that. It's not necessarily about colonialism or whatnot. It's because these men have become so confused about these sorts of issues that we're talking about right now, that out of angst, out of a sense of desperation, they become very easy fodder for recruitment by these sorts of groups and ideologies. I've not seen very many people talk about this. This has been my observation. And like I said, I base this on applying some of the things that Wilhelm Reich wrote in his book, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, to that particular situation. And I'm seeing very clearly the patterns that Reich talked about. Reich was talking about more in the context of 1920s and 30s Germany, that there was this, how do you put it, this sort of repressed mass sexuality that then was responsible for pulling people into the rallies and into the National Socialist camp, etc., and then ultimately into the war and the death camps of Treblinka and whatnot. And reading that book about 5 years ago for like the third time, this is when ISIS was at its peak. I began to see the very similar patterns happening in that context as well. But what I also observe is that many Muslim families in diaspora and also back in the home countries and communities are unequipped. Their imams do not know how to tackle the problem. So if somebody goes to them, whether it's a couple or it's an individual, the most that they can do is talk about from their own experience, or they give them a few quotations from the Quran and Hadith and leave it at that. And these people leave a lot more confused than when they went in. Exactly. And this pattern is repeating itself without anybody addressing the problem. Now, my approach of this from a metaphysical point of view is very obvious, but it is a perspective that not everybody can necessarily understand and live by. But what I want to do is I want to stop this damage, and because what I am seeing and what I'm witnessing around me. And I saw this also in Germany, and I've, with some of the people I've interacted, in your part of the world in North America,
Hmm.
it's the same thing. So there are two options. We either find innovative ways to at least address the problem about what is going on. Or, we just basically sit back and do nothing and watch the problem watch it get bigger and bigger and mutate and become a festering cancer that then eventually with this will completely destroy these communities, which is ultimately what the forces of chaos, what the Ahriman, what this beast of a machine actually wants to happen. Because if they want, you think about it, cultural destruction through colonialism, through the outward conquest of a people only goes so far. But to really destroy a culture, you have to destroy a culture from within. The West did it to itself, by destroying its own traditional cultures. I would say pretty much consistently from the 19th all the way to the end of the 20th century until now. And now they have turned, to the East, and particularly the Muslim world, particularly that seems to be the last bastion holding out against some of this stuff. But nevertheless, we also have our own problems. There are outmoded ways of doing things that we need to discard.
Yes.
Because they're not serving us anymore. And we need to transmute this situation so that, people, the very things that people always took for granted, healthy, balanced relationships between a man and woman, the cycle of life continues in a balanced way.
Sheikh, I thank you so much for sharing this, because this is a much, much needed conversation that needs to be had. I look at these old photos from the 1950s America, 1940s, and I see the man dressed in a nice suit. His wife is dressed nicely. They have traditional kids, a traditional family, a home. Then I realized something over time, there was something that destroyed this. And as I see now with the adult industry, or what we call the seduction industry, where there's so much perversion between the divine feminine and masculine, it really has mentally messed up a lot of people. Even if they don't intend to, it's there. They have mentally upset themselves, where they have these genres where they're basically urinating on women, they're slapping them, they're choking them, and all of this despicable stuff, which goes against the true nature. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the man and woman for each other. And this is the reason why now you have so much disconnect between a man and a woman, where the woman has unrealistic ideals about a man has unrealistic ideals and hopes and wishes from a woman. And you have to realize that there was something that broke this natural bond. What is it that interfered? What force was it that interfered, that didn't want men and women to connect with each other? And it's happening in my culture as well. I'm from Pakistan. I'm here in America. There's so many men and women now that are just scared to be in relations with each other. And there was one guy I knew here in the US, and he was seeing a woman, like, the same story that you had shared about that gentleman. And he asked her, would you marry me and settle down with me? And then she cried. She said, no, I'm traumatized. But that same woman is so damaged, she's not realizing what's going on with her, where she's jumping from one relation to another, one man to another, because of probably what happened in her childhood. So there is that trauma. There's also a trauma-based mind control that's happening in America as well, where what happens to these kids, whatever in their childhood, they grow up, they're promiscuous, they're wilding out, they're rebelling against this anger that they have inside. Instead of finding an aspect of healing of it, then you have so not only you have a traumatized society, Sheikh, but now you have the seduction industry attacking them. Now you have this men and women with multiple children from multiple partners. Then there are patterns where if a child grows up seeing a mother with multiple partners and multiple children, they end up falling into the same pattern. I've seen that happen too. And in Pakistan, I've seen a lot of especially men, they're watching a lot of this adult content and having unrealistic because it's repressed in many ways, so they have to express their ideals and their frustration in some way. So Islam, those bastions there in the East being the last stronghold, that's why they're hitting them hard with this content. So not only the men are watching it, the women are watching it too. And it's creating that disharmony between the men and the women about what is the true love? What is a true relationship? What is that true feeling between a man and a woman? And that true harmony, which has basically continued the existence of the human race up until this point. And right now, it's at a very pivotal time, Sheikh, because I recently went to England. Last time I was in England was 2019. I went now after 2 years, and I found there was a change in the vibe. Something had changed where I felt that there was a lot of darkness there, which had engulfed the hearts and minds of the people. I guess you had the Brexit issue, then you had COVID, and on top of that, they were having, I guess people are still having issues. I was sitting outside of the London Eye, and I was waiting for my Uber to come get me so I could go home. It was getting late. And there were three instances where I saw where a woman was walking with her a husband or boyfriend, whoever, their mate was, and the woman was crying. I saw one, then the next couple I saw, the woman was crying. Third couple I saw, there was a man, woman, and child, and they just had this like huge disconnect with each other. Like you could feel the vibe and the energy. And I realized what is going on with these people. And there was something that has changed. And I prayed, whatever reason Allah sent me there to that land to pray for those people, that they get hidayah and they get help and they get some realization about what's right and what's wrong. In America, I'm seeing the same thing. It's no one's trying to marry each other, find true love. And I was speaking to my parents also, saying that in your generation, things were much simpler. People were simpler. There wasn't these industries destroying people's lives, their minds, and people had healthier relationships. Myself, I'll be 30 on my next birthday, and I
For
haven't
sure.
found it. I haven't found anybody yet. So, and it's in a society, Sheikh, in here, or if I go to Pakistan, they'll just see me as a blue passport to come to America, but they
Mm.
won't see me as a human being who's trying to settle down and trying to do the right thing. And here you grow up in a confused society where people just don't know what to do. They're stuck in two different worlds. Especially if you're an Easterner, you have to act a certain way at home, a certain way in the world. There's just so much confusion and chaos going on. And you're right. There's one thing you told me which stood out to me is, how do you destroy this enemy? People have to get back to their spiritual practices. That's one advice I know, which is eternal and timeless, which you have shared. And I thank you for that.
You're welcome, but we are in a war, and these forces are both seen and unseen.
Mm,
And this transcends just mere confessional identity either. It's beyond just the community of Muslims,
yes.
because this thing has also destroyed the family and has destroyed relationship. Like I mentioned, beginning with the West itself over the last 200 years. I mean, even up to about 30, 40 years ago, if you speak to an older generation of people in the West, and you say, compare your time to this time, they all come with almost the identical kind of complaint. Even folks that were living in the 60s during the height of the flower power and the free love and all of that, they look at the times today as far different, and the mentalities of the people today as far different than their own time. Now, these forces that are bent on destroying the human relationship, it's very simple. These are the forces of capitalism and corporatocracy. And just as Naomi Wolf, became an advocate and a writer on the issue of, disaster capitalism, we don't have to look at it from the macro level of human societies that are destroyed by disaster capitalism that then go in and rebuild these countries to make a profit. We can look at it from the micro level of the unit of the individual and families and couples, etc. Is that the same sorts of thing is happening in our societies, not just in the West, because there's no longer an East. The whole, the West, the Occident has basically engulfed the planet, if you would,
Yeah.
which as a symbol I find quite interesting, because in the philosophy of Sohrawardi, the Occident represents the realm of the material, represents the realm of what is fallen, into the quantified material existence, and the path back is to the Orient of light. So the Occidentification of the planet, where there is no geography anymore, where you can say this is the East. Whether you go to Lahore or Islamabad or Tehran or Berlin or London or New York or Los Angeles or Beijing or here in Australia, whether Brisbane, Sydney, whatever, we're living under almost an identical process and an identical paradigm. People have become almost the same. Yeah, they may talk differently. You have a different accent between Australia and the United States, etc. But fundamentally, the very same things, the very same struggles, more or less, exist here. And with the internet and with the globalization of the internet, we are, in a sense, living in a small village, as it were, a small global village.
Mm-hmm.
But the kind of promise that was held for the internet back in the early 90s when it went viral through the university systems, and comparing it to today, is also a different world. I mean, I remember the promise was immense that finally all information would be democratized. But then you saw some very weird things happen at the end of the 90s. And leading up to it is that the corporate world and corporate America began to look at the internet with great, as a great threat. So they began to very slowly buy up things. And then the weirdest thing, which to this day, I look at as being an engineered event, was the NASDAQ crash of 1999. I actually lost a lot of money during that event myself. And it was one of the reasons that gave me the reason to leave America permanently and move to Australia at the time, and take my late father's offer to come and work for the family business at the time. Because had that event not happened, and you had a whole generation of kids on the, just basically on the ground floor, kids out of garages, kids with going to, very modest universities, or, kids whose families had saved over a lifetime and sent their kids to places like Berkeley, all of a sudden were becoming millionaires overnight, just by, basic innovations in coding and programming and that sort of thing. And companies like Microsoft and et cetera looked at this as a threat. And this is the very era where Silicon Valley in the United States, in California, in that whole area of San Jose, California, began to come up by taking over this entire thing. So that was the era that I remember. One of my friends who is on my Facebook wall, Richard Barbrook, and a comrade of his, wrote this very influential paper as this process was happening, when the internet was being taken over by corporate America, called the California Ideology, where they predicted that basically that these sorts of things were about to happen over the next 20 years. And it was this text, the text of social science, was almost prophetic. And at the time, I mean, a lot of people looked at this as kind of a dystopian kind of doom and gloom kind of prognostication. But in retrospect, I think the Times has either exceeded their worst expectations of where we were at. And when you come back down to the level of, the very basic building block of a society, the relationship between the man and woman, we are living in a sort of dystopia. And these forces are very deliberately attempting to break all of this down. Now, this particular process where relationship in the family is concerned, one can say that it really began in the West in earnest during the 1950s, because Wall Street realized that in order to expand capitalism and to consolidate itself, it required to break families apart. Why? Because the more people who are broken up require their own domicile. So, if you have a family who lives in a house who has one refrigerator, when you break this family apart, you have, two refrigerators and potentially more refrigerators. A family that lives together back then, shared one car. Today, right, a family that is broken apart potentially is 3 cars. So, you factor all of these various things in, and you see that, like I said, the sorts of things that Naomi Wolf talks about in terms of disaster capitalism is a paradigm that has been implemented in societies in the West itself, consistently since the post-war period, and maybe, these processes began piecemeal even before that. But after the Second World War, this thing really went into high gear. Now, I have very mixed feelings and very, my jury is still out about the whole, moratorium movement of the 1960s and the flower power and the hippies and all of that, because I see many different factors, many different dynamics, many different causalities at work, lot of them legitimate, and I also see the reaction of the system at that time, which tells me that that what was happening in the 1960s had a legitimacy to it. Nevertheless, what happened, particularly in that area of the free love, created unbelievable problems in the subsequent generations afterwards, particularly when you go into the 1970s. Many of these folks of that time, and we don't even have to get into the discussion of the privileged class that was engaging in all this activity at the time. But what you see going into the 1970s and into the 80s is that all of a sudden the divorce rates start to expand. The term of marriages and families begins to shrink down. So whereas, previous to that era, you had a family that, at least on a normal level, a couple would marry and they would, even on the most modest level, for 30 years, they would be together. As you start to move into the 1970s, from the 1960s, the term of relationships and marriages starts to shrink down to 10 to 5 to 2 years in America itself. I mean, there's multiple studies about this. And once we get into the 80s, you have an entire army in North America itself of single parents, which didn't exist to this level in the generations previous to this. And then on and on and on it goes. So whereas I look at what happened in the 1960s, and particularly with the moratorium anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, the coming up of people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, Black Panthers, the Brown Panthers, the American Indian movement, all of these various groups who were genuinely and sincerely fighting for rights and a valid share of the pie of that society. All of that was legitimate. But on this particular issue of the not so much even the flower power and the psychedelics, but the free love and what it did to the minds, to the psyches of the people of that era going into the decades afterwards is something that only now is beginning to be understood. Now, I'm not a prude, in any sense of the word. But nevertheless, I recognize that there is a causality at work, and that when certain things are normalized in a particular society that have not existed previously, and the disruptions that they may create are ones that, metaphorically is letting a genie out of the bottle that goes haywire forever without any potential of putting this genie back into the bottle. We cannot put the genie back into the bottle in the way that we want. So Muslim communities and the imams out there, who are, preaching a very prudish kind of morality, sexual morality to their, kids, they have to understand that only works in a society that recognizes the validity and legitimacy of that way of behavior. But when you're living in a society like this, which no longer has a boundary of East and West, what you have to teach your children and what you have to teach the people that come to you is far beyond that, right? You have to then start to delve into the very metaphysics of Eros, the kind of things that Julius Evola is talking about in that book. And like I said, unfortunately, other than maybe, those one can count on a single hand, a lot of the current leadership of today is not equipped. And conversely, in a society, for example, like Iran, the kind of hypocrisies that are prevalent in that society, rather than establishing the kind of traditional morality that at least purportedly the seminary claims that it wants to reestablish, it has done the very opposite thing. And so even if this current system in Iran falls apart, which I believe eventually it will, what you're leaving a subsequent generation is a completely damaged and destroyed generation mentally on the most basic level of its relation to the world at large. And how do you begin to rectify that? The only way that this can be rectified is that we need to build more metaphysicians out there, but not reactionary metaphysicians. We don't want to create an army of Rene Guénons and even Julius Evola and the like. Real metaphysicians, people who have real experience, who understand these symbols, not just on an intellectual level, but on a lived level. I hesitate to use Jungian because I have, although I have a love-hate relationship with Carl Jung, there's certain things I love about him, but there's certain things that he certain tacks that he takes that are just completely, in my opinion, banal. These things are not merely abstractions of the mind, because every thought that you think produces an ontological reality in the world that you live, right?
Yeah.
So the mind and what comes out of the heart and mind is not just something that is abstract and relevant to an individual cocoon from reality. Everything that you're thinking, ultimately, even if it is a insignificant act as a result of your thought, will have repercussions, and a reality will come from it. So what I mean by having real metaphysicians out there, building an army of metaphysicians and people that understand this dynamic and this causality. So for lack of a better word, we need to bring up a generation of magicians, as it were, or occultists, who have real experience of this reality, and can do something with it, and then can see the problem and rectify the problem. What a traditional shaman in a traditional shamanic society, the kind of services that he or she would offer to his tribe and community. This is what we need to bring up in this generation, this coming generation.
Sheikh, that is absolutely true. And it's interesting when you mentioned the aspect of the capitalism. There was a woman that I had listened to, it was a few years ago, and she said the reason why a lot of those movements were funded, because a lot of the international bankers were looking at America from a very specific point of view from their eyes. And they said, okay, you know what? If we break up the families, we're going to have more taxpayers, because the women will enter the workforce. And like you said, instead of having one fridge, they'll have two fridges, one car, two cars. So it's making somebody money. So as long as it's making somebody money, they will behind the scenes manipulate it in a way and tell you that it's about women's rights or about these rights. But in the end, it's just to destroy the human family and to pit one against each other, which we're seeing to this day, even in our post 2021 world, almost in 2022, where there's still such a disconnect between the divine feminine, the divine masculine. And which I want to ask you, Sheikh, for those, let's say, men that are raising daughters and the women that are raising sons, what kind of world and what kind of knowledge and teachings do they have to give to their children? And also to those men and women that are suffering from any addictions from the seduction industry and their perception to mentally heal themselves so they can see a man or woman in a whole way again. So the aspects of raising these children in today's age, to teach a daughter what to expect from a man when she grows up, what would be a real man for her, and what is her role as a divine feminine in today's world. For a man, a woman can and a father can teach him what is your role to be a divine masculine, and to what to expect from a woman, and what is your rights and responsibilities to her, instead of these religious hypocrisy, like you said, we're seeing, where just to maintain pleasure, they have these little temporary marriages and religious laws, which goes against everything, what al-Islam is, to honor both, just like our Fatimiyya Sufi Tariqa, to honor the divine feminine, Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam. So please, I would love your explanation on that.
Well, as a single father myself, not by choice, but by tragedy, this is a very difficult thing. And it's one of my daily struggles with my own little Nuriel. A man who is a single father has a responsibility beyond himself to simultaneously both mother that child and be a father to that child. So you have to go the extra mile, and you cannot neglect anything. And it's no longer about you, your wants, your needs. No, you have to put yourself second, third, fourth, 100 behind. Because that soul that is.
Sheikh, please repeat the last 30 seconds. I think the Zoom started acting up again.
Okay, what I was saying is a man particularly who is a single father has a responsibility beyond himself. This is in itself as a journey, a single fatherhood, of a child, and especially if you have a daughter, your responsibility is even more because you have a responsibility to both be a mother and a father to that child simultaneously. So growing up, and basically resolving any of the personal problems and the weight that weighs on you is a paramount thing. You have to be a rock for that child, and especially if it's a girl, and protect that child. And also, you have to also then learn to love again, in a sense, because when you love that child properly, that is what they will then take with them into every other relationship out there, right? Now, that's the ideal. The fact of the matter is that, in my opinion, a single man, and I say this even from my own experience, is not mentally or biologically prepared, in a sense, to raise a girl on his own. And I say this from my own experience because these are things I struggle with on a daily basis since my wife tragically died in 2019. A man can raise another man. So a single father is equipped both emotionally and physically to raise a son on his own, just like a mother would be emotionally and physically equipped in most cases to raise a daughter on her own. But this relationship, and women can actually do this with also boys as well. So mothers of single sons are, in my opinion, far better equipped to raise both genders of children than men are. But a man really has to go that extra mile with a daughter, and not just extra mile, but extra 10 miles, 100 miles more with a girl, because a girl is both a robust and very fragile thing. She is the mother of the future, in a sense. So if you are poisoned yourself, then you are poisoning the future, because that is the womb through which the future will emerge. And this is where notions of the divine feminine become very immediate. It's not just about a ideal pie in the sky kind of thing. It's something that you must then practice on the immediate level in your own life with your own child. And so this has been the challenge to me, in a sense. The passing of Roya, in many ways, has been the challenge to me to live immediately on a constant daily basis my own principles and my understanding of the divine feminine. Because here I have a girl that I need to raise, not just as to build her up into a together human being, but potentially my successor in the future. So this task becomes very, very heavy. I wish there was a woman around me who could help me at least, or be there as a support. But this is the hand I have been dealt. So I have that responsibility to raise this child now on my own and ensure her future is established. And by that, I don't mean financial or material. I mean on the emotional, spiritual level, which is the most important thing. Because once those tools are given to a child, then they can basically form their own reality themselves. If they want to go after the material being and only focus on that, at least they have some level of togetherness to be able to accomplish that. Although my opinion is that people who are more and more sensitive to the world of the spirit become less and less prone to walk into that path. But nevertheless, we have to also live in this world, unfortunately, and we have to, basically there's a rat race out there, and people are woefully unprepared. So damaged people are going into a rat race and getting more damaged. And this rat race is not just about bringing in home the proverbial bacon, but it is also the interactions that then occur in that dynamic of that society between men and women out there. So where the workforce or the work environment also becomes the terrain where potentially you meet a person or whatever. One thing that is very regular is that co-workers are forming ad hoc relationships with each other, outside of the context of the work environment. And by ad hoc, I mean that these relationships don't really go anywhere. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they end up in long-term relationships, but more often than not, they become flings. So the reality of the fling, I will jump into the sack with this person X, and then, that will end. Then I will jump into the sack with person Y, and that will end. and so on and so forth. Whereas the West, at least on the level of the mainstream, looks at this as mainstream, looks at it as a sexual liberation. The fact of the matter is that they don't talk about, and I've talked to so many different counselors, psychologists, and whatnot over the years, and they have, basically agreed with me about this point, is that this reality is damaging people.
Yes.
More than it is helping. So this is not, it's not sexual liberation, because even if you take sexual liberation from its, from its authentic tantric context, right? Sexual liberation leads you to enlightenment in the tantric context. It leads to the integration of the personality and liberation beyond the confines of matter. What the so-called secular liberation of the West in its material context has done is fragmented people, confused people, and turned people into, it's created this explosion of mental illness, where because of these, wounds that people have suffered through, jumping from one relationship to the next, on and on and on, they go, they are damaged, and so they cannot cope. So then the psychiatric industry is now flourishing to medicate people who can no longer cope with these realities. People experience all kinds of tragedies, but the thing that really, really makes people mentally ill is when the heart is broken. When your heart breaks, there's a saying in a lot of the poetry in Persian that the lover, now whatever status or whatever timeline this lover may have, always leaves their imprint within the heart. The beloved always leaves an imprint in the heart of the lover, no matter what it is. Whether this be, that is why, that in Sufism and in these sorts of paths, to expand the scope of the identity of the beloved, it becomes so important. So that, for that very reason, and we are cut off again.
Yes, I hear you.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the reason why, when in a path such as Sufism, when we expand the reality of who the beloved is, right? Where we look at the beloved as both being unique in itself, one, right? Being God, being Allah subhanahu, but at the same time, that light, because of the whole ishq, whatever term that you use, being projected into individual objects, right? If we understand this amphibolous relationship between God and humans, but when we really get to experience that dynamic, then the heartbreak that normal humans experience that damages them no longer becomes that. Because particularly when you take on the metaphysical perspective on board, you realize that the real, al-haq, self-discloses itself in multiple loci of manifestation. So the heartbreak that you have experienced in one situation is only a teaching that will manifest in another loci of manifestation, so that your love for that particular person is not the end, and it's not the only love, because the only love belongs to God subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in the materialist West, rather than teaching something like that, right, that empowers people to look at the reality of multiple relationships from a metaphysical perspective, they are materializing it, right? They deny the existence of the spirit, right? They ridicule it. They push it aside. Everything is about the tangibles, right? It's about your career. It's about, how much money you have in the bank. You are assessed, judged in those terms. Your relationships are primarily transactional in nature. They have no real depth to them. When you're in that kind of a reality, then what you're dealing with, where you have a open sexuality in a society like that, is no longer liberation. It's actually bondage of the worst possible sort. And what it is creating is a human collective that is damaged, and then is going to inflict more damage on the generation that comes after it. And who laughs all the way to the bank? The corporatocracy, the corporate world, capitalism.
Exactly.
Is the one that reaps all the benefits from all of this, right?
Yeah.
And that is why, and I've been saying this to a lot of Marxists out there, who are beginning to ask some very important questions, is that the most revolutionary tool that we can adopt in this time is to return to a valid metaphysics.
Mm.
Now, there are a lot of in proverbial highway robbers on this road of getting, of getting there. And the far right and a lot of these neo-Nazis and fascists of this era have tried to appropriate the language of metaphysics and take, the perspectives of all these worlds for their own benefit. But the left also can benefit from all of this. In fact, more so than the far right, because we understand certain things about the notion of time, and the dichotomy of time, at least the dialectic of time, as it were, that a lot of these far rightists and neo-fascists are running away from. And we also have to understand that when we take that perspective aboard, then we begin to see that this particular time that we're living in is a time of transition. But the transition, to push the transition from transition stage to another stage, from this polarized dialectic into its synthesis, is something that will require human beings to put effort to make it happen. And the first part of the effort that is necessary is for human beings to begin to understand that we have a problem. And that, your hand-me-downs and the things that you take as given in this particular time are not necessarily the way things that should be done. And on the very basic level of desire itself, to become, quite intuitive and mindful of your own desire. Now, all of these texts, in all of these traditions, they all say exactly the same thing. The desire is a veil towards the realization of the spirit. And this is true, but simultaneously, the poison is the gift. Mm-hmm. So desire is not only a veil of hindrance, but possibly the veil of light that needs to be cast aside to realize the reality of what it is. And this is why, these tantric teachings of India are so powerful, because they talk about this in a very alchemical way. And so, the age of Kali, this Kali Yuga that apparently these tantrikas talk about that we're presently in, requires us to step up, not reject anything, to engage in a process of collective alchemy, first with ourselves, then with the society at large, to get to where we want to go, to rectify these problems, resolve the dialectics, resolve the polarities, and it begins with the self, and then it goes into the realm of the man-woman relationship. Once these two things, once the personal self and then the two selves of the man and the woman are rectified, or what the Kabbalists talk about in terms of a tikkunim olam, or a tikkun, a rectification occurs. Once that rectification occurs, then it is natural that this will, go out into the society at large, and then we actually do the sorts of things that these new agers are talking about. We do heal the society at large. But we have an enemy, and this enemy is in our way, and this enemy is extremely crafty, and this enemy has every single one of the characteristics that all of these texts and scriptures talk about, the shaitan, al-billah. And it acts this way, and it acts this way in the outer, and it also acts this way in the inner, by incubating ideas, false notions, poison pills into the minds of people on a collective level, on a constant basis, day in, day out, whether you go online or off front line, in your work environment, in your interactions with people on the street. So this mindfulness that I'm talking about is one of the armors, one of the weapons
Sheikh, do you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. We keep getting cut off.
Well, it looks like, the shaitan doesn't want this talk out there. So please repeat
No, the shaitan doesn't want this talk out there. It doesn't want its days numbered, and I want its days numbered, then this is what I'm saying is that people need to work on themselves.
Yes.
As the first part of the alchemical process,
mm-hmm.
right? And then once that occurs, then you go out and then recreate this alchemical process in the rectification of the male-female relationship, right? None of these things, what I'm saying, is easy, and people shouldn't take it that way. There's a real engagement necessarily, and this engagement is a tough one, especially with what we're encountering, because like I said, the enemy is crafty, very crafty enemy that we are facing. This enemy is not one that one takes for granted. One has to be armed in the mind, in the heart, and also out there against what this enemy is capable of doing. So from the first perspective is to introspect. So these tools that all these traditions have laid at our feet are important ones of self-reflection, using the names of God to think about your issues. What at least in the tariqa is called the tafakkur, to think, to contemplate, using the names of God to basically be your own therapist, right? Because there's no therapist out there, no teacher out there, no counselor out there that can act better than yourself about what is in you, right? You can spend years in therapy, right? And you will not get anywhere close to the crux of the matter. A lot of it is because you human beings, and the things that they hide in the wells of their own hearts are only things that they themselves, these pebbles that they themselves need to take out. So by using the names of Allah subhanahu to do that, to do a counseling project, a self-reflection process with yourself, it's something that is a powerful tool that I think, especially from our part of the world, it behooves more people to take on board and accomplish things. And once you know more about yourself and what makes you tick and what has brought you down, what has brought you up, then you're in a position to then begin relating more with other people, and especially with the female of the species.
Yes, you're absolutely right. And that's what we have to do.
Are you there, Salman?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Are you there?
Sheikh, do you see me and hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. We keep getting cut off by Zoom.
No worries. But inshallah, you're right, Sheikh. Everything we have to visualize those practices. We have to get deeper into our practices, and we have to basically know what is this enemy that is doing against us. Identify those things, because we are dealing with someone and something on this entity on a global level, not just in America or Australia, but all over the world, that's there to divide the man, woman, and child, the three aspects which carry the humanity into the future. That's what they want to destroy, from my perceptions, what I've seen here, what I've seen in England, what I've seen in Pakistan, all over the world. It's these three that are under the most attack collectively. And we have to visualize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our heart, in our spiritual practices, and know ultimately that good is destined to win. No matter what evil does, no matter what plots or schemes they hatch against a man and a woman, good does win. And you're right, all those things in workplaces I have seen here in the West, where married women, women in relationships, even with me, they would approach me and I would say no. I would tell them, be loyal to the individual that put his trust in you. And which, inshallah, I hope that karma is returned to me as well one day.
Inshallah,
And
inshallah.
it's very true. They're traumatized. 9 out of 10 women I've seen here in America, the ones that are jumping from one relation to another, 100% of them are going to therapies, to therapists, to dealing with different peoples, because they don't realize which each person you are with, you get spiritually linked to them. And you don't know what that individual's background could be. You could be dealing with a diabolical person, but they don't know that. That's why the society is so traumatized. It's broken. You have all of these etherical connections. They're all like, if you look at the pictures of one of those electric fences in India, and you see like the wires all over the place, that's how a lot of these people are out here, because they're all so connected to each other. That's why in their hearts and minds, they're so traumatized. Drug usages, relations are broken, the seduction porn industry. It's very damaging, especially to the new generation growing up, where majority of them have this in their hand, the phone.
Yeah.
Anything they want at the click of a button, they can watch it and see it, which is at the discretion of the environment that they're growing up in. whether they're being raised by a mother, father, single father, or collectively as a couple raising their children, or they're under the leadership of a murshid, a spiritual guide. Those disciplines have to be reenacted. There's a great Sufi friend of mine from Pakistan, and he says, Salman, there are two people in the world. And I said, tell me, who are they? And he said, the first one is one with no discipline, and the second one is the one that has discipline. So it's two people in the world. You have to be the one that's disciplined, because the shaitan is going to do everything and anything possible to destroy you, because the sons of Adam are his enemy, and he swore to destroy you. So when you're dealing with an enemy of that tenacity, then you have to make sure that you're 10 steps above him with your discipline, with your spiritual practices, under the guideship of a sheikh, murshid, a spiritual leader who's guiding you. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, Sheikh, is the aspect that those that are not guided, they're in darkness. And we need our parents, our murshids, people that love us, we love them, to guide us. And that's when we will know. If I go to Pakistan, a woman can look at me with genuine love without seeing me as her ticket out of the country. Or over here, it's the same exact thing, where they can genuinely love each other without the feeling of lust, without the feeling of flesh, and just genuinely have that empathy and love in their heart for someone. And it's like the Persian story of the Persian prince Rustam. And Rustam destroys all of his enemies, no matter what forces the shaitan puts in his life, the demons that chase him, everything and anything that get put against Rustam. He put his faith in the Almighty and in himself with his disciplines and his spiritual practices. And we can learn from these heroes and these examples that we can do this. We have a lot of men and women that are traumatized, but know thyself, know thy Lord. And when you heal thyself, you will also begin to see the world in a different way, from that childlike, innocent manner where a child looks at everyone with love and a smile. And that's the world we have to return to, because that's what the enemy doesn't want. And you have laid it out in a very articulate and very beautiful manner. And I hope those that listen to you in part 7 of this talk take the aspects of becoming a metaphysicist in today's society very seriously, because it's needed. And I mean, it's interesting. Every time I meet people, Sheikh, here, England, wherever, first thing they ask you is, what do you do for a living? Why don't people ask each other,
Yeah.
who are you? What makes you a human being? And what is in your heart? How do you see humanity? First thing because it's all about money, they ask you, oh, what do you do for a living? And this another thing, another one of my Sufi friends said that when somebody asks him that, just tell him I'm a Sufi. That's what I do. I'm just here to spread love and light to the world.
That's I've done that. I've done that myself many times. Well, I mean, the question, why people ask that kind of question and why it's become normative is that a person's worth in a society such as this is only assessed on the basis of their productivity to that society.
Mm-hmm.
So, and productivity is defined in the society by earning potential.
Yes.
And earning potential is defined by what rank in what kind of an industry you occupy. So if you are, a CEO of X company, and that is what you do, then your worth in this particular society outpaces everybody. So there's an inversion going on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as much as I bag on some of the traditions like Rene Guénon, whatnot, he lays this all out in his own book, The Reign of Quantity and the Sign of the Times, about what is happening, why that is the case, and why this is the mentality. Because even in societies of the past, where an individual in some sense was defined by their craft, the fact is that in those pre-modern society, these crafts had a fundamental initiatic function. So if you were, for example, from as a mason, if you were a stonemason, right, you were not just a mason, stonemason, carving stones for whatever, but you had a larger perspective on certain things, and this was understood in that society. So your craft was not just merely what you were producing for X, Y, and Z, but who you were simultaneously. This has all changed because a good example of this is how artists are now devalued. There's so many artists out in the world, right? But an artist makes far less than the CEO of a company that makes, for example, let us say, some of the most banal things that you can imagine, right? Yet the artistry of the artist is what is ornamenting the productions of a lot of these CEOs. You see how backward everything else? Without the artistry and the aesthetic of the artist, these CEOs of these major companies won't be able to sell their products to water, as it were. There's a saying in Farsi that says that. So this is how backwards everything is and how quantified everything has become, where nothing is value other than in this consensus reality of what value itself is. Yes. So the people who actually are producing, this would be a segue in the next podcast that we make about Marxism and Islam. Yeah. So what is produced, in a society is arbitrarily given value by that which it's in itself possesses very little value. Okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And for those that are listening, our next podcast we're going to do with our Murshid Sheikh Wahid Azal is going to be on the aspect of Marxism and its alignment with Islamic mysticism teachings, and the aspect of what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, envisioned with the Medina welfare state and making sure everyone was provided for in an equal and balanced society in alignment with Karl Marx's vision to make sure that everything was kind of basically human values and human beings being treated equally. So, to our beloved Sheikh, are there any closing thoughts you would like on this subject before we conclude?
What I would say is that we have a lot of work to do. I am, on some level, I'm dismayed by a lot of what I'm hearing from people, the feedback I'm getting, especially from men. So I really have my work cut out for me. This gentleman that has been seeing me, I have another meeting with him next week.
All right.
I've given him a few things to do and counsel. I hope this time he comes to me and he's a little bit more, relieved of the angst that the last couple of sessions I've had with him before. But yeah, we have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of damage that needs to be fixed out there. And these things are very tangible and in your face, and people who want to shun this sort of responsibility, they have to reflect that all of these things, people who are broken relationships, the confusion in the man-woman relations, all of these things will come to your doorstep in one form or another. If it's not to your personal doorstep, then into the doorstep of your family members, your children, etc., and on it goes. And that's why there is an immediacy, to attend to these things as soon as possible, and rectify them as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheikh. And you're right, there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but in order to solve any problem, you're right, first you have to recognize that there is a problem, and then you work out a game plan with patience and realize, okay, this is what I have to do to reach this objective. And you're right, it will take some time, but when there are people like yourself and other great souls out there that are teaching and guiding humanity, I think we do have some hope. And I'm grateful for your light, for your presence. And, everyone I encourage, please listen to our dear Sheikh Wahid Azal and what he's teaching us about men and women. And please stay tuned for our part 8, which will be on is Marxism and Islam and the similarities the teachings share. I give my love to my Murshid, my brother, my friend, and my elder with the greeting of Nur Alaikum.
Wa alaikum Nur.
Thank you all again and hope to see you soon.